And so thank you for joining us today. My name is Brianna and I'm the chair of IPF Atid Boston. So for those of you who are new to our community, IPF Atid is the Young Professionals Program of Israel Policy Forum, an organization dedicated to building support and fostering nuanced conversations on the two-state solution and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict among American Jewish community and the policy community. Before we get started, I want to invite everyone to introduce themselves in the chat. So tell us your name, your city, and the most interesting thing that you've read recently, a book or an article. This is just me fishing for things I want to read, but we're doing an icebreaker for it. So if you'll put that in the chat so we can at least get to know everybody who's on the call without the black hole of a time suck of actually introducing ourselves over the call. And then I'm very excited to introduce our special guest today. So Mohammad is the director of the Center for Shared Society at, I might kill this pronunciation, Givat Haviva. There we go. Our conversation with Mohammad is going to focus on his work as leading political analyst and expert on Jewish-Arab relations inside Israel, as well as the Arab community's relationship with American Jewry. And this is not a webinar. This is a small group, so we encourage you to participate in the conversation and ask Mohammad questions once we get to the Q&A. We want this to be an open and free-flowing conversation as much as possible. So feel free to also put questions in the chat as we're going, and we'll be sure to get to them and give you a chance to ask them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jonah, the vice chair of IPF Atid in Boston, to ask the first few questions, after which we'll open it up for the Q&A.
All right, thank you, Brianna. Thank you again, Mohammad, for joining us, and thank you to everyone who came. So our first question to Mohammad is, Mohammad, could you first just start by telling us broadly the story of Israeli Arabs or Palestinian citizens of Israel and go over some of the most pressing issues they face?
Of course, John. First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you, Brianna, for the introduction and the welcome. As I said, you probably do not recognize two people on the call, and that's my colleague Barry from Israel and Doron from New York. So they're with me. So don't be intimidated by outsiders. Regarding your question, Jonah, I mean, the issue of Arab citizens of Israel was born with the creation of the State of Israel. We're not talking about the population that immigrated to Israel. Rather, Israel immigrated to us. It's the indigenous population of this land, call it Israel, Palestine. I don't care what name you feel more comfortable with, but it's the indigenous population. You know, specifically speaking about my family, I'm talking to you from my village, Iksal, which is just south of Nazareth in the northern tip of the Jezreel Valley. My family has lived here. I'm 27th generation, close to 750 to 800 years. My kids are 28th generation, which means that we're talking about the population that lives in its homeland. And it's not an immigrant population. And the key question is that I probably would want to lead you to later on is, are we living in our country? I mean, we're confident that we are in our homeland. The question is, are we in our state? Are we in our country? And there is a gap between the state of Israel defining itself as the state of the Jewish people, full stop, not the state of the Israelis. If Israel would be like America, the state of the Americans, then I would feel that, you know, this is my country, this is my state. Rather, I live in a country that says to me, I'm the state of the Jewish people, 79% of the population of the state of Israel, and maybe an equivalent number of Jews like you living overseas. This population was kept until 1966 into some kind of an on-hold status under military administration, although granted citizenship already in 1949, in January 1949, in the law of citizenship, and actually even welcomed in the Declaration of Independence to stay in the state of Israel and be part of its growth and prosperity with the promise of equality, three types of equality: social, economic, and political equality. We do not have neither of them, neither social nor economic, and not political equality. And I'm making clear distinction between three types of equality spelled out in the Declaration of Independence. In 1966, the State of Israel basically made its mind that this population is not on hold anymore. It's not going to exchange the Palestinian Arab indigenous population with Jews from Arab countries anymore. The Jews that are already in Israel are in Israel. So the concept of population exchange, which was present until 1966, was replaced by a process of integration of the Arab citizens in Israel. Basically, the Jewish state decided that from that moment on, it drops the idea of a pure Jewish state, meaning state for the Jews only. And it's going to have a significant portion of non-Jews residing in it as citizens. And that was the beginning of a new Israel. In Israel, 1966 was an Israel that the status of the Arab citizens became legitimate status, not an on-hold temporary status, but a legitimate status. And basically, the Arab citizens started realizing that they are here to stay, and the state started to examine its relationship with this population. And we've been going since then with some kind of a tension. One tension, I call it the vertical debate about whose state is it, the state of the Israelis or the state of the Jews. And the second and the horizontal debate is about social and economic equality. And that's a trend that is going on all the time. An interesting point of history was already in 1992, 1995, during the Oslo negotiations, when Israel was negotiating what we would call an end of conflict with the Palestinians. And the status of Arab citizens was not on the table. Not Israel. Israel didn't bring it to the table, to the negotiations table, and neither did the Palestinians bring it to the negotiations table. It wasn't just avoidance, it was a choice of Israel and the choice of the Palestinians not to bring this issue on the table. At the beginning, Arab citizens of Israel were some kind of insulted that everyone, they thought that they're part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but suddenly no one is talking to them about being part of the solution. So you're part of the problem, but not part of the solution. But with time, within a couple of years later, everyone started realizing that actually it's good for us because this allows us to stay home. That the option of displacement, of ethnic cleansing is not going to be on the table. That we're going to stay in Israel, that Israel accepted our Israeliness, and not only that, but the Palestinians also accepted our Israeliness. And with time, we started daring to define ourselves as Palestinians by ethnic identity, with more and more Israelis accepting our Palestinian identity. So today you have a situation that almost 80% of Arab citizens of Israel do include the term Israel in their definition, and about 75% do include the term Palestinian in their self-definition. So it's some kind of a new hybrid identity. In the past, it used to be called Israeli Arab. Today, the most common name is Palestinian citizens of Israel. And as I said, people are not shy anymore of defining themselves as Israelis in front of the Palestinians or as Palestinians in front of the Israelis. This hybrid identity, which used to be seen maybe in the past as some kind of a deficit in the identity. We're not 100% Israelis, we're not 100% Palestinians, maybe we're only 80-85% Palestinians and 80-85% Israelis. In the past, this was a deficit in both identities. Today, we add the numbers together, so it's 80 plus 80, that's 160% identity. It's basically feeling that we do belong to both identities, but we have our own uniqueness. As Palestinians, but with Israeli citizenship, our Palestinian identity is more ethnic, national, historic, cultural identity. Our Israeli identity is more civic identity, more economic identity. And you see it exemplifying itself also in social characteristics, in the way we participate in the elections, in the status of Arab women, in the topics of education that we study, in the way we dress. You see the Israeli identity very present, and you see the Palestinian identity very present. Today, I would say that the massive majority of Arab citizens have clarity on one issue. One is that Israel is here to stay, and we're here to stay in it. The idea, it's like feeling as if we are in some kind of a bad divorce between our mother and our father, our national identity and our civic identity. And what the child wants most in this case is a nice divorce. We don't want a bad divorce because we want to be able to have access to our national identity and access to our civic identity. And we want to also good relations between those two parents, so to speak, so that we do not feel that we need to be torn apart between them when they are in a fight. And especially if this comes across and surfaces when there is actual physical combating between Israel and the Palestinians. But with time, we also learned even to accommodate those toughest situations by creating what I would call a firewall between the Arab citizens and the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, not importing intifada-like struggle against occupation into Israel, not to bring in violence in confrontations inside Israel for one simple reason. I would even say for one selfish reason, because we have a tomorrow to worry about our relationship with the Israeli citizens, our relationship with the state of Israel. We need to ride the same buses the next morning. We need to go to the same workplaces. We need to go to the same hospitals. We need to go to the same universities. So we can't break the relationship to the level of confrontations that might be considered sometimes acceptable or legitimate or understandable when you cross to the borders and you deal with the issue of occupation of the West Bank and Gaza.
Great, thank you very much, Mohammad. And I think that actually ties well with the next question when you talk about like more Palestinian Arabs feeling part of the Israeli identity. You actually initially ran a party for the latest election called MAN Together. So could you briefly, just for a few minutes, tell us what your MAN party was about and why you felt compelled to run it?
Well, this was, I felt it was time to make maybe political revolution in Arab politics. The elections a year ago, the Arab citizens basically went with the strategy of unity. Let's unify the Arab political vote and maximize our representation in the Knesset. Getting 15 seats, the joint list got 15 seats in the elections a year ago, and the result was zero. They were marginalized both by the right wing at the time and the left wing at the same time. The right wing haven't taken them into consideration ever into potentially joining a coalition, and neither did the left wing, except for the period of late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was dependent on the 5 Arab members of the Knesset between 1992 till 1995, until he was assassinated in 1995. That was the only time, for 3 years only, that a government in Israel was dependent on its majority in what we call a safety net agreement with Arab political parties. They did not join the coalition formally. It was some kind of what I would call a love affair, an out-of-marriage affair. The marriage is full coalition membership, is ministerial seats in the government. So the feeling that was developing over the last year in the Arab community was, well, we know that the Israeli-Palestinian arena is pretty much stuck. The diplomatic process between Israel and the Palestinians is stuck. And with the Trump deal of the century, or joke of the century, that was even showing that we're going in a twilight zone in that process. I studied English literature in my undergraduate degree, and my professor used to tell me, when you read the text, read the subtext. So the subtext of the Oslo agreements and the subtext of the deadlock in the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations for us was seek your own destiny. Don't remain dependent on the regional arena to solve your civic issues. We have issues of education. We have severe issue of crime in the Arab community. Last year, 2020, 112 Arab citizens were killed by Arab criminals in Israel. That was 70% of the victims of crime in Israel. 70%. If you go to the West Bank, which is equivalent number more, even 50% more population, they had 27 murders. In the Jewish population, they had also something like 30 murders. In the Arab community, which is only 21% of Israel's society, we had 70% of the killings. Simply, we are at war. We're at war with crimes, with crime, with gangs, Arab gangs inside the Arab community. And the reason for that is police negligence. The police, the Israeli police, does not deal with the Arab community, what we call under-policing. You call the police, someone is knocking in your door trying to shoot you, and they say, come file a complaint. Come file a complaint. You can't get out of your house because someone might be shooting at you, and they tell you, come file a complaint. If you can't do it today, come the next day. There's no sense of safety. In the same time, during the Corona period, unemployment rate was almost 3 times the national average in the Arab community. Poverty in the Arab community is about 5 times the poverty rate in the Jewish community. So the numbers are simply crying loud, and the Arab political performance in the Knesset was stuck in, I would say, one role only, which is expressing anger and frustration. So you can get to the podium in the Knesset, you can have the wonderful freedom of expression that Israel's democracy has, but when you talk about, when you bring it to the issue of result, when you try to cash those statements with something significant that happens on those burning issues, nothing was happening. The year before, it was 96 people that were killed. Then in 2020, it was 112. And already in 2021, we already more than 35 to 40 people. Crime rate is still going up. So the sense in the Arab community was saying, okay, we are in a crisis. The current political performance is not getting us anywhere. It's time to make a change. It's time to make a change and move towards from expressing anger and frustration towards influence. And to be influential in Israel, you need to be part of the coalition. You can't just be part of the legislative body. You need to be part of the executive body. The executive body in Israel is, the executive branch is the government. So I proposed this to the Arab community. I ended up folding the whole project 8 days before the elections. But interestingly enough, when I folded it up, we made this quick, not that quick, but we did the long, deep study with more than 1,200 people. 9% of the Arab citizens, which is almost 90,000 votes, equivalent to almost 2.7 seats, they were ready to vote for me no matter what. I call them the suicide unit. They knew that giving me that many votes is not enough, but still they were willing to burn their votes and not vote to the other alternatives, not to the 2 other Arab political parties, and not to Jewish political parties. Because voting to Jewish political parties in the past taught us that it doesn't get you any real results, but also voting to the Arab political parties and increasing their size to incredible numbers also doesn't get us anywhere. So 9% were willing to suicide politically. Vote knowing that you get nowhere. 19%, and that's another almost 200,000 votes, were saying to us, we would have voted for you if we were confident that you will pass the threshold. But we know you're not going to pass it. You know, it was a quick organization. Within 2 months before the elections, we were already out there. And people are saying, you know, you can't get to the Knesset that quickly. And that was the most, I would say, frustrating part of the elections, knowing that people want us, but they're not confident in our passing, and that's why they're refraining from participation. The third number that was interesting was 24% of the Arab community, in addition to the 9 and 19, were saying that this is the right agenda, integration and participation in the decision making, but we don't know you. I didn't bring any stars with me. I was the only one with maybe 78% rating of recognition. People knew me, but my number 2, 3, 4 hardly had 4% and 5%. I brought some kind of executive figures and not political or media figures, not people with any track record of public exposure. It was mostly professional career of success that they brought. And we didn't have enough time to convince people that these are qualified enough people. So, but if you add the 9 plus 19 plus 24, that's 52% of the Arab community that says this is the right path. Now, when we decided to back out and to back up and not to continue, we were expecting that many of those will continue and will respect our guidance to vote. We asked them to vote for the joint list, which we felt was the closest to us ideologically, but that wasn't successful. Less than 20% of our voters ended up participating in the elections. About 12% voted to the joint list, about 6% voted to the United Arab list, and about 2% voted for merits, but 80% did not vote. They do not see the alternatives, even though we told them go and vote for the alternatives. They didn't like that. They wanted to vote to something new. They're sick and tired of the old. Arab politics now wants politics that touches on 4 main issues: dealing with the issue of violence, getting jobs, and that's mostly economic issues. The third is housing issues. There are 50,000 Arab homes with demolition orders against them. 50,000 demolition orders against them. That means almost 20% of the Arab households in Israel are under the danger of being demolished. And the current political leadership is not getting you anywhere. And the fourth issue is education. We have a community that is very hungry for education. If you just get one indicator, we are today 19% of the student population in Israeli universities, plus about 9% that study in the West Bank and in Europe and in Jordan. So we are about 28% of Israel's student population when we are only 21% of the population. We're beginning to comprehend the minority status, realizing that you need to equip yourself with extra tools, mainly in education, for social, economic, and political mobility in the state. And I wanted to reflect that. I wanted to reflect the fact that in the medical industry, for example, 30% of the medical industry in Israel is Arab. It's 23% of the doctors, 55% of the pharmacists, 35% of the dentists are Arab. And it's huge growth. And that middle class, I would say, that is beginning to develop in the Arab community is seeking a different kind of political engagement, which is more service-oriented and less ideology-oriented.
Very good. Thank you, Mohammad. For my last question before we open it up to a roundtable discussion, actually touches upon a little bit what you were talking about before. I was going to say, as you know, in the summer of 2018, Israel passed its controversial Jewish nation state bill, which led many people to question Israel's identity as a Jewish and democratic state. How do you, as an Arab citizen of Israel, think Israel can be both a Jewish state and a democracy? And if I were to just give one more note to prompt you, I've heard you talk about this before, models for national minority status in Europe, because you were talking about that minority status. So again, as an Arab citizen of Israel, how do you think Israel can be a Jewish state and democracy, and maybe reflect a little bit on the national minority models in Europe in just a few minutes?
That's a big question, Zona. Eli, hi, Eli. Eli heard me talk about this sometime, and he knows that I can probably talk for a whole semester about it. But let me start by saying that the nation-state law in Israel is a big shame in the face of the state. It's a big shame for Israel, a big shame for Judaism. I say it with great deal of anger from one end, but also pain and feeling of insult. Because that law is basically saying to me now, in a sense of what we call de jure, legally, that I'm a second-class citizen. Until that moment, it was de facto second-class citizen. It was less budgets, but they talked about equality. It was less money for education, but they talked about equality. They were confiscating land, but they talked about democracy. They reduced our chances to get budgets for municipal development, but they talked about equality. They talked about the democratic nature of the State of Israel. Until that moment, democracy and Judaism, the Jewish and democratic nature of the state, were of two equal values. And that sort of vague area allowed us some breathing space. Talk about two values that are equal, fine. So the de facto was something that you could fight slowly and say, okay, time is on our side. It's all about convincing the individual Jews that we can coexist and we can live with each other. It's to develop economic partnerships between one Arab and one Jewish municipality. People will learn to live with each other, and with time, we will accomplish equality. And this nation-state law said, hell with equality. There's no equality. It's not going to happen ever in Israel. Maybe social economic equality might happen, but political equality will never happen in Israel. Jewish ethnic national political identity is above anything else in Israel. And actually anything else doesn't even count. Because nation states is something legitimate. Europe has many nation states, and Israel is a copy of one of those European countries. That's where Zionism started. That every nation deserves self-determination in the shape of a state. Legitimate. That's how history worked over the last at least 150 years since, what's his name? I forgot his name, who initiated the concept of nation states in, I think it was 1848. His name will come to my head soon. But meanwhile, nation states did two corrections that Israel is not doing. One is democracy, and democracy means it used to be one man, one vote. Now it's one person, one vote, with the gender correction in the process. Because there were countries that did not allow women to vote until very late afterwards. The second correction that nation states did was to say, okay, if this country is for a certain nation, what do we do with groups that do not belong to that nation? Do we redraw the borders and give them some kind of affiliation to another state? Which was the case, for example, between Germany and Holland in 1956. They redraw the borders in a way that left very few Dutch people in Germany and very few Germans in Holland. I think it's 30,000 on both sides. But even those, what we call them leftovers in Europe, and in 23 different cases, in 23 different groups of national groups in Europe, they were given collective rights. They were given a collective status, saying, okay, wherever there's an ethnic majority, there's also an ethnic minority. I mean, if you were not a majority, then you would be complete. But there's an ethnic minority that deserves collective rights. Now, there are 23 minorities as such recognized in Europe. There are many more that are not recognized. Those that are not recognized are what we call migrant populations, not indigenous populations. Indigenous populations get their right for maintaining their identity, maintaining their lifestyle, maintaining their connection to specific geographic area, because often those, as I started even by saying, what connects me to my homeland is not the Palestinian flag and it's not the Palestinian national anthem. What connects me is the graveyard outside my house with my 26 ancestors in it. It's the 64 olive trees that I inherited from my great-great-grandfather who planted them 400 years ago. It's a water well next to my house, which was dug by my great-great-grandfather 350 years ago. That's it's a different connection to homeland when you talk about a national minority. It has a sense of belonging. whether it is geographic. In my case, it's not just geographic, it's spiritual. It's, when I think of homeland, I close my eyes and I think of a homeland, I think of the sunrise from behind Mount Tabor and the sunset behind Mount Precipice in the Galilee Mountains. It's very, very narrow sense of belonging, which is very, very geographic. And so that's why some kind of even different legal status was given to those kind of geographic areas. You know it in the States, in the reserves, the Indian reserves. Indians were given some kind of status. In some places in Europe, it's a 5-star status. In the US, the reserves are maybe 0-star status, where sometimes it goes from anywhere from complete autonomy and self-determination, all the way to just cultural recognition, just recognizing language, allowing you to present to that court maybe some documents in your own language, and maybe a celebration day once a year where, like you do the march, you do a march in one of the main highways just to celebrate the multicultural identity. So and the 23 different minorities in Europe have different 23 arrangements. So there is no one size fits all. But the concept is that if the majority deserves collective rights, then the minority deserves also collective rights. And those can be represented either in the flag or the national anthem, or just as a matter of respect, that the Prime Minister will meet and greet the representatives of that minority in a special celebration day once a year.
Thank you. That was great. And now we're going to transition a little bit to open it up for questions from the rest of the group. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or just come off mute and you can ask them yourself. And I will hold off on some of my questions so others get a chance to ask a question.
I'll jump in. Thanks, Brianna. Hi, Mohammad. Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
I'm curious, going back to the elections piece, if you could say a little bit about your perception and your community's perception of Mansour Abbas. There's been a lot, like I've read a lot in recent weeks about, from the Jewish press in particular, about Israeli Jews potentially being more open to Jewish-Palestinian partnership, Jewish-Arab partnership politically as a result of Abbas's role in the current electoral landscape. And I'm just curious if that resonates with you, if that feels true to you as well, or if you would like to see what role you would like to see him play, if any. Just any reflections on that would be great.
Thank you, Eli. Again, it's also good to see you. Eli, I think, was one of the first people that brought me to Boston. I spoke at Harvard, was it 4 years ago or so?
Yeah, about 4 years.
Yeah. The story of Mansour Abbas is rather exciting, and it's still in the making. He might come out to be the most positive thing that has ever happened in our history, and it could be the worst thing that has ever happened in our history. We don't know how this is going to unfold. But meanwhile, this is challenging Israeli political scene and the way it deals with Arab politicians. As I said, the closest Arab citizens, Arab political parties came to being part of a government was during the Rabin period. And even Rabin, the leader of the left at the time, shied from inviting them to his coalition. And he ruled with a minority government of 56 seats versus 59 seats of the right wing. And the 5 Arab members of the Knesset at the time gave him that safety net in a no confidence vote. So they voted with him, and in exchange got a big package of social economic benefits at the time, but not official representation as ministerial positions. There is as I said, there is an appetite in the Arab community for what I would say all-in full engagement in Israeli politics, not to shy anymore from wanting to be ministers in government. More than 80% of Arab citizens support the joining a coalition and even taking ministerial positions. Something, by the way, that not Mansour Abbas and not the Joint List are willing to do now. They are both shying away from it although more than 80% of the Arab public are saying go for it. They're still hesitant about it. But the trend, the push in the Arab community is for that concept of full engagement. As we are making it at universities, as we're making it in the medical industry, as we're moving faster and faster in the high-tech industry, let's do it also in the political arena. But the leadership has its own reserves. Mansour Abbas broke that kind of reservation a bit. And in order to attract the attention of the left wing, he's using, which has been the most negligent. I mean, center left, that's what Mansour Abbas said yesterday. He said, I'm sorry, this morning. He said, we lean towards center left. We feel more comfortable in the center left government. But the center left doesn't look at us. They're not, and he even said that cowards. They're afraid of what the right wing is going to say about them if they bring the Arab politicians to be part of their coalition. So he said, my strategy is to go to the lion's den. Is that the word for it? If the problem is the right wing, why am I running after the left wing? Let's run after the right wing, give them an opportunity at the time of a crisis. They need to save even Netanyahu, with all the disgust we have towards Netanyahu, but let's increase our value. And if Netanyahu pays the price that the left wing is not willing to pay, then we will go with him, and we will get results to the community. And in the process, we will teach the center-left a lesson of how to deal with us in the future. On the second part, teaching a lesson, I think he's teaching a very good lesson. It's coming out with the misery of Benjamin Netanyahu, who seems to have run out of Jewish voters for him, or Jewish supporters for him in the Knesset. So he's now begging for any member of the Knesset to support for him. Just a year ago, he was against Arab political participation in elections. Arabs are flocking the ballots, it's Bibi or Tibi. He was delegitimizing Arab political participation. And now he has his hands stretched, begging for support. And with Mansour Abbas saying, wait a minute, he's saying, I'm not going to make a deal with you until you even crack the extreme right wing, Smotrich from the, what's the name of his party, Jewish Zionism, until that party apologizes to the Arab community. I mean, he's going even beyond Netanyahu, challenging the extreme right to start to becoming more apologetic towards the Arab community. I think it's a very, it's a good game he's playing, but it's a very dangerous game because ultimately he might end up with the right wing in a coalition. And I think if we end up with another 4 years of Benjamin Netanyahu, I think it's a disaster, maybe not for the Arab citizens, but at least for the Palestinian people. And I think that Mansour Abbas doesn't care much about that part. He is part of the Islamic movement, the global Islamic movement of Islamic Brotherhood that cares, similar to Shas, about sectorial needs, mostly religious needs. I mean, what did he get from Netanyahu in the last 14 months? To the Arab community, nothing. To the Islamic movement, a lot. Mostly, almost all the appointees for imams in mosques, which is a government job, for muazzin, those that call for the prayer, which is another government job. Our sheikhs, the sort of rabbis that do the ktuvah, that write the wedding, the Sharia court system, it's administered now by the Islamic movement, thanks to this bargaining that Mansour Abbas has done with Netanyahu. In my view, to the Arab community, this is bad, because this is putting the, it's like Orthodox Islam above all Muslims. It's exactly what he is doing with Shas. Put Shas as the ones that run the Jewish life in Israel, and he's putting the Islamic movement to run Muslims' life. Who said I want to be run by political Islam? So there is aspirations, political aspirations of on the Israeli-Palestinian issue are zero. They have no aspirations there. And I would say towards the Arab community, I would also dare say they have no aspirations. They're only worried about their cult, exactly as Shas is worried about their cult. It's much about money, much about power and control. The Islamic movement itself, the voters, they got about 160,000 votes. That's about 16% of the Arab population. More than 2/3 of that were the pragmatic Arab citizens that wanted to see influence, and less than 1/3 of that are members or actual supporters of the Islamic movement. It's exactly what Shas did. They, in the name of religion, then they speak in the name of the Sephardim and the name of the poor, but they're actually a specific religious cult that is only caring about their own specific interests. So I can't be too happy about this.
Thank you.
So I want to give time for others to ask a question, but I actually have a question. And it connects to what you were speaking about a little bit earlier, but historically, Israeli Arabs have overwhelmingly supported a two-state solution. And so what is your perspective on this? Is this something that you think is shifting? There's been a lot of talk recently in some spaces about a confederation, and we talked earlier. So what are your thoughts there?
That's a good question. It's a shifting question because it changes by the hour. I did a lot of polling in the last couple of months, and when we asked people, what do you want from your representative in the Knesset, 91% listed dealing with personal security, deal with the violence, jobs, housing, education. 91%. Only 5% said the Palestinian issue and the Palestinian state is number one issue. When you ask them about what's your second issue, 56% put the Palestinian issue as second. When you say, would you vote for a political party that does not attend to the needs of the Palestinians and the need for a Palestinian state? Less than 20% are willing to do that, which means 80% still consider this to be something important to be in a portfolio of an Arab political party or even a Jewish political party, which means clearly center-left. 80% of the Arab community on this issue, they know exactly which side they want to be in. Now, with that level of support and aspiration for the issue, the feeling that this is actually going to happen is becoming less realistic. I think this started in 2006 with the Palestinian split between Hamas and the PLO, or Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. That signaled to the Arab community that the Palestinians do not have their act together. And until they get their act together, they're not going to be eligible to actually negotiate with Israel. To be honest, I still think that's true. As long as the Palestinians do not have their act together, Israel would continue to say, who would we negotiate with? Who would deliver the Palestinian people? If we negotiate with the Palestinian Authority, would Hamas accept the deal? It's a debate that is not, for the last 15 years, this reduced the belief that we're getting any closer to an agreement. And that's why the issue became still important, but it's losing its priority, or it's dropping in the line of importance in the eyes of Arab citizens. But still, more than 80% think that a two-state solution remains the best solution there is, or the most realistic solution there is. I personally think that I also believe in that, mainly because I believe that Jewish Israelis would not want to see a one-state solution replace the state of Israel. And I think the majority of Palestinians would like to see independence even for a few days, forget 3 years. And to enter this kind of best solution that you suggested, which is a confederation, from a place of equality with Israel, and not from a place of coming from occupation into some kind of a confederation where Israel is the strong dominant party there. Most Palestinians, by the way, also support what we would call a three-party confederation to include Jordan and not only Palestine and Israel. They see close connections with Jordan. 60% of the Jordanian population is Palestinian. They see Jordan as their entry door also to the Arab world, and it also has space, geographic space, for any potential need for housing needs or industrial needs or tourism needs, whatever you want to develop. The West Bank and Gaza is too little, too small to accommodate the Palestinian people's needs for the long term. I also subscribe to that. You know, I think it was Shimon Peres who once called this a Benelux agreement. The Benelux agreement, it was the nucleus of the European Union when it was Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. That's Benelux. Those were the first three countries that were the nucleus for the EU. And that's what I think is probably needs to be what happens. The question is if we can at all get to there, and if so, how can we do it, maintaining the national identities of each country, where each country continues to serve the national interests of every nation, but allows the freedom of people to live and move throughout this area, as you have it in the United States, as you have it with Europe. I mean, Europe is probably closer model to what I support. So it's not a federal level, but more confederal arrangement. But maybe even that, I don't know how this is needed. I think it's more realistic, but I'm not sure if it's the best, because maybe 2-3 generations down the road, they would say, okay, let's have a big party that, you know, we can have a federal system and not just a confederal system. You know, confederal system is what you have in Europe. The federal system is what you have in the United States. But I don't think really there is a future. There's not a long-term future for two-state solution. It's a step in the right direction, but I don't think it can last for too long. You need to tie Israel with that future Palestinian state in some kind of a confederation, and it would be better to do it also with the state of Jordan, with the kingdom of Jordan.
Interesting, thank you. Does anybody else have a question?
If you have a question, unmute yourself.
Yes. Otherwise, I still have questions.
I have questions also to myself.
I just want to react if I can, Brianna. It's an interesting point on what you just said, Mohammed. I think it's an important one. I think especially us in the States, we wrap our heads around terminology as we rightly should. And we have a sense of what a two-state solution means and would look like. And we maybe have a growing understanding of what a confederation could look like. But in reality, in practice, what happens is what would happen. And what you call it is what you would call it. And I think sometimes when people mention confederation, they might be talking about the same thing that what a two-state solution person's talking about, because there's overlap. And one example that I know, Jonah, you've written about is about if there was a two-state solution, what role would Jordan play in maintaining security for both those two future countries? And it's almost like, you know, and Jonah, you can talk about it if you want, but there's like a report that IPF's worked on with security partners that kind of talks about a confederation of security between Israel and Jordan and the Palestinians. Does that mean it's not a two-state solution? Does it mean it's a confederation? I think it's just an interesting wrench to throw into conversations like this?
Well,
For the record, I don't know that much about it, but thanks for having confidence in me. Yes, Mohammed.
Adam, I don't think any solution is going to be an everlasting solution. It's going to be a transitional solution. The needs of Israel and the Palestinians today are not the same needs as 70 years ago, and their needs 70 years down the road are going to be also very different. We don't know what's going to happen, and that's why we need a good transitional sort of stage. The two-state solution is a good transitional stage because I think it at least quantifies land for a future Palestinian state, quantifies land for future Israel state. It puts borders. This will get this issue together. It puts some kind of limits over the issue of aspirations of Palestinians for return versus aspirations of Jews for Aliyah. So you clarify where those couple of issues at least come. I'm not sure you'll be able to have a permanent solution for Jerusalem within the next, maybe there will be some kind of transitional period for the next 20 years that might be extended for another 20 years. I don't know. I think that the nature of any agreement between Israel and the Palestinians will be transitional. It will be moving to some stage that we're not even sure what it is, but in it, you need to build in strong security arrangements that allows us to move to the next stage. So to stabilize ship, as they say, reduce animosity, reduce violence, allow people to trade together, to tour among each other, to exercise religious freedoms, to maintain human dignity, to feel that you're embraced by the other. And this would allow people to mature into something more comfortable. I mean, many of the Arab towns in Israel used to have Jewish families living in the same neighborhoods and the same buildings. If you come to Israel today, the nearby town next to me, Nofa Galil, which used to be called Natsat Elite, it was built to be a Jewish town. Today, 38% of its population is Arab, living in the same buildings as Jews. You go through 38% of the town. You go to Beersheba, attracting more and more Arab citizens moving there. You go to a town called Harish, was built to be a Haredi Jewish town. 25% is Arab today. You go to Tzfat, 8% Arab. You go to Carmel, 8% Arab. Those are, what the dynamics of what's happening inside Israel is more and more mixed towns. When in the past we used to have 7 mixed towns, I think today we have maybe 17 or maybe 27 mixed towns. And those towns deal with issues they didn't deal with before. And such as yesterday there was a court against the municipality of Nofa Galil, Natsat Elite. Why? Because they're not allowing the Arab population to open an Arab language school. And the municipality still claims we're a Jewish town and we provide Hebrew education only. I mean, if you go to Akko, the Arab population in there is much less, but they do get education in Arabic. How come Nofa Galil has double the size of the Arab population, but they do not provide services in Arabic, educational services in Arabic? So those are challenges that the ground beneath us will continue to move all the time. When I went to Hebrew University in Jerusalem, the percentage of Arab students was hardly 2%. When my daughter went to Hebrew University, it was 19%. And the university recognized the month of Ramadan as a special month and not exempted, deferred exams that fell after 1300, after the 1 p.m. to another date, because they didn't want to test her when she was fasting, because they wanted to get her give her the chance to get the best results. In the calendar of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, you see one holiday where students do not go to classes called Eid al-Adha, a Muslim holiday. The university is shut down. And Christmas. That's the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Did it make it less Hebrew? No. Did it make it less Jewish? No. But it made it more respectful to its Arab students who feel more at home and feel more welcomed. And the Jewish students get 2 extra vacation days. Everyone is happy at the end of the day. That's why I always say, Adam, look at what's happening inside Israel. I think this is a microcosm of what could happen outside. And that's why I work for Givat Habib.
So
that's why I think that working on Jewish-Arab relations in Israel is square one, where we can prove that Jews and Arabs can live and work together. We create, this is our lab where we can come up with programs and activities to show, as we did in the past, we can show that we can do it. And I think that we are creating many islands of success that the rest of the Arab world is examining with lenses, magnifying lenses to see how we can do it. And I believe that those successes will transcend to the rest of the region.
So that's actually really great, because that goes into both my last question and actually what Nora just put in, which you already spoke a little bit about, like why it's important for both Jews and Israeli Arabs to become more connected. But I think in the last kind of minute or two we have left, if you could speak to why it's important for American Jews and Israeli Arabs to become more connected, as well as how you think we can do that. So that would be awesome. Thank you.
Well, in very simple terms, Israel defines itself as the Jewish people. The Arab citizens want Israel to define itself also as the state of its citizens. Most people think this is an either or. It's either a Jewish state or the state of its citizens. And I think both leave one group outside. So if you define Israel as the state of the Jewish people only, it leaves me out. Then it says to me, I'm not your state. If you say Israel is the state of its own citizens, it leaves you out. And that's why I think Israel needs to be both the state of the Jewish people and its citizens. It's not either or, the state of the Jewish people and its citizens, which means there are 3 shareholders in this country. It's the Jewish Israelis, it's the Arab Israelis, and it's the American Jewish or the diaspora Jewish population. This is your country as well. So you have a duty and responsibility to make sure that it serves the 3 shareholders. And you do not take side by moving it to go in one direction versus the other. Recognize what I personally recognize. I commit to Israel as the state of the Jewish people and its citizens at the same time. And I see them as complementing values and not contradicting values. And once you believe it, act on it. And I will share with you some small piece of argument I used in a debate with Professor Arnon Sofer. Arnon Sofer is a professor from Haifa University. He studies demographics. And he's always said that the Arab citizens are a demographic devil. Ultimately, they will take over Israel by birth rate. By the way, this is a false and this is lie, because the growth rate of the Arab citizens is 3.1% a year. The growth rate of Jewish citizens is 3.2% a year, thanks to the Haredi population. But what is interesting is that an Arab woman with a university degree and a job has less children than a Jewish woman with a university degree and a job. So I told him that instead of being racist and claiming racist claims against Arab citizens, put your hand in your pocket, become generous, give a scholarship to an Arab woman to get a degree, get a job, and she will promise you less kids. So we can meet on mutual interests once we recognize that we can fight the positive fight and not the negative fight. And as I said, that's what we do at Givat Khalifa. And that's what I also expect you to put your hand with Doron and work with him. He runs our New York office. Doron, maybe you put your email in the chat, and if anyone wants to be involved with Givat Habiba in the US. Basically, it's an operation that tries to help us and get the contacts and funding. Please contact Doron, and we'll be more than happy to continue the relationship with you. And when you come to Israel as individuals or as a group, you're more than welcome to come visit Givat Habiba. And I promise you good coffee if you visit me personally. And maybe even good hummus.
Great. And on that note, thank you so much, Mohammed and Brianna. So thank you all so much for joining us today for this important conversation. Special thanks again to Mohammed for sharing your insight with us. If you're new to IPF Atid and want to learn more about our work in Boston and across the country, there are many ways to get involved, and I encourage you to reach out to Alex here, Alex Letterman, our staff. And I'm actually now going to turn it over to Alex for some closing announcements for IPF Atid and staff.
Thanks so much, Jonah.
Bye-bye.
If you, all right, bye. All right, bye, Mohammed. But for those of you who are still with us, we have an event coming up on Thursday that I hope you guys will be able to join, featuring Shir Efron and Hussein Ibish on expanding Israel's regional integration. I'm going to put a link to register in the chat right now. But if you have any other questions about our work in Boston or across the country, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm going to also put my email in the chat really quickly. And that's it. Thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Have a great